My daughter-in-law screamed that I was a bitter, lonely old woman who deserved to die in that house alone. Then she shoved me so hard I hit the corner of the dining table and slid to the floor. My son stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. I looked up at both of them from the hardwood floor my late husband had refinished with his own hands, pressed my palm against the side of my ribcage where the pain was sharpest, and smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt tremendously. I smiled because 6 months of patience had just paid off in a single, glorious, stupid mistake. I told them I was fine, that I just needed a moment. Then, while my son helped his wife gather her coat and her composure, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sent one text message to my attorney. It said 3 words. They took the bait. What they didn't know, what neither of them had any idea about, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment since the week after Thomas's funeral. My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm 67 years old. For 31 years, I practiced estate and trust law in Charlotte, North Carolina. I spent 3 decades watching families destroy themselves over inheritances, watching people who had never once asked their parents how they were doing suddenly appear with attorneys of their own the moment a will was read. I had seen every version of that story. I thought I was immune to it. I thought I had protected us. I was wrong about one thing. I never imagined it would be my own son standing in the doorway. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end, which was both too long and nowhere near enough. He was 69 years old. He had been a high school history teacher for 35 years, and he was the kind of man who remembered every student's name, who kept handwritten letters from former students in a shoebox under the bed, who cried at the end of every Ken Burns documentary. He was the best person I have ever known, and the house on Birchwood Lane was as much a part of him as his voice or his laugh. He had planted every tree in that yard. He had built the bookshelves in the study himself. He had chosen the kitchen tiles one Saturday at a salvage shop in Asheville, carrying them to the car in stacks, delighted as a child. Our son Daniel had been at the hospital for the last 2 days of Thomas's life. He held his father's hand. He cried. I believed, in those moments, that grief had softened him, reminded him of what mattered. I gave him that grace. I extended it for months after the funeral. When he didn't call, I told myself he was processing. When he came for Thanksgiving and spent most of the visit on his phone, I told myself he was distracted with work. When his wife Crystal made a comment about the house being a lot to maintain for one person, I filed it away and said nothing. I had spent 31 years in courtrooms and conference rooms. I know what the first probe sounds like. The next call came 4 months after Thomas passed. Daniel, not Crystal Daniel himself, which meant it had been rehearsed, which meant it was serious. He asked if I had thought about simplifying. That was the word he used. He said the house had 4 bedrooms, that I was only using 1, that Crystal's parents were going through a difficult time financially and needed somewhere stable to land. Just temporarily. He said it quickly. The way people say things they know are wrong. Just temporarily, Mom. Just until Frank and Linda get back on their feet. I asked him a few gentle questions. How long was temporarily? What had Frank and Linda been doing since they retired? He fumbled his answers. I said I would think about it and I would call him back. I did not call him back. Instead, I called my friend and colleague Patricia Wells, who has been my attorney for 20 years. And I said, Patricia, start the clock. We have maybe 3 months. I had already transferred the house into the Calloway Family Trust 2 years before Thomas died. When his diagnosis came through, we had done it together. Sitting at this very kitchen table, reviewing the documents until past midnight, with cups of tea gone cold. Thomas had understood immediately. He had looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said, You're thinking about Daniel. And then his video says, I hadn't answered. He had signed anyway, because he trusted me. And because 35 years of watching human nature, from the front of a classroom, had taught him the same things 31 years of law had taught me. The trust was ironclad. The house was protected. What I needed now was not legal protection. I already had that. What I needed was evidence and a reason. I needed to know who my son had become. I hired a private investigator named Carl Reeves, a quiet, thorough man I had used twice before in complex estate cases. Within 3 weeks, Carl had sent me a file that confirmed everything I had suspected and several things I hadn't. Frank and Linda Hargrove had not simply hit a rough patch. They had a pattern stretching back 12 years, a bankruptcy in Georgia, a civil judgment in South Carolina for unpaid contractor fees, a recent situation involving a personal loan from a credit union that had been referred to collections. They were not people experiencing temporary difficulty. They were people who had made a lifestyle out of landing softly on someone else's money. Crystal, my daughter-in-law of 7 years, was in a more complicated position. Carl's report noted that she had been quietly accessing a joint savings account she shared with Daniel, moving money in small amounts into a separate account I was not supposed to know existed. It was not a dramatic sum. It was the kind of careful, methodical withdrawal that spoke less of desperation and more of long-term planning. She had been doing it for 11 months. My son owed money, not a catastrophic amount, but enough $40,000 on a personal line of credit he had taken out without telling Crystal, according to a source Carl described only as reliable. Gambling, most likely. Thomas had worried about that tendency in Daniel since his 20s. We had had the conversation more than once. I sat with that file for a long time. I sat with Thomas's reading glasses still on the end table beside me, where I had not been able to move them, and I read every page twice. Then I did something that surprised even me. I quietly, anonymously, paid off Daniel's line of credit, every cent. Through a mechanism Patricia arranged, untraceable, clean. A gift I would never receive credit for. To a son who would never know it came from me. I needed to see what he would do with a clean slate. I needed to know whether the man Thomas and I had raised was still somewhere underneath whatever had been built over him. The answer came 6 weeks later, when Daniel called again. This time his voice was steadier. He sounded almost confident. He said that Crystal's parents really did need to move in, that it was a matter of family loyalty, and that he felt it was time we had a more serious conversation about the future of the house. He said he had spoken to someone, a friend who knew about these things, and that there were options available to families in situations like ours. He didn't say the word guardianship. He didn't have to. I knew exactly what options available to families meant. I had seen it dozens of times from the other side of a conference table. He had not come to me grateful. He had not come to me changed. He had come to me with a plan. I told him to bring everyone for Sunday dinner. I said I wanted to meet Frank and Linda properly. I said I was lonely, and it would be good to have a full house again. I spent the week before that dinner making careful arrangements. Patricia drove up from Charlotte, and we sat in Thomas's study for 4 hours going over documents, contingencies, and a precise sequence of events I needed to unfold in a specific order. I had the trust documents, the full investigative file, and a separate legal brief Patricia had prepared, outlining Crystal's unauthorized account activity. I had a small audio recorder, the kind that looks like an ordinary pen, which Patricia had confirmed was legal to use in North Carolina under single-party consent laws. I had also had a security camera installed in the dining room and living room 2 weeks earlier, the kind that are nearly invisible, connected to a cloud server only Patricia and I had access to. The one thing I had not done was change the front door lock. Patricia had raised an eyebrow at that. I told her to trust me. They arrived at 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening in March. Daniel drove. Crystal sat in the passenger seat and did not look at the house as she got out of the car. She looked at it the way an appraiser does a quick, systematic inventory. Frank and Linda Hargrove climbed out of the back seat, and even before we reached the front door, Linda had remarked that the porch railing could use repainting, and Frank had said the driveway could fit a second car once you clear out the garage. They had not said hello yet. I had made Thomas's pot roast, the recipe his mother had written out on a note card now taped inside the cabinet door. splattered with 30 years of use. I had set the table with the good dishes, the ones we only brought out at Thanksgiving and Christmas. The ones Thomas had unwrapped very carefully every year and rewrapped just as carefully afterward. I had done all of this on purpose. I wanted them surrounded by evidence of a life they were planning to dismantle because I wanted their behavior captured in that context. Dinner was cordial for the first 20 minutes. Frank talked about himself. Linda asked 2 questions about the neighborhood, specifically whether the houses nearby had sold recently, and for how much. Crystal ate carefully and watched me. She was always the most dangerous one, because she was the most patient, and she was watching for signs of what she and Daniel had started calling, according to Carl's most recent report, Mom's confusion. That was the word they used, confusion, as in, we're just concerned about Mom's confusion. As in, there's been some confusion about the finances. A word chosen deliberately, worn smooth from repetition, ready to deploy. Daniel waited until the plates were cleared. He had the look of a man who had practiced what he was about to say in the car on the way over. And possibly in the shower that morning. He set his hands flat on the table, which is something Thomas used to do when he was about to say something serious and wanted to make sure you knew it. It broke my heart, watching him use his father's gesture for this. He said they had all been talking as a family, and they were worried about me. The house was too much. I was too isolated. Crystal's parents needed a place, and it made sense, financial sense, practical sense, family sense for everyone to come together under one roof, at least for a while, with the understanding that over time, arrangements might naturally evolve. 7 years of litigation had taught me to hear the thing behind the words. What he meant was, we move in, we establish residency, we get our names on things, and then we make it difficult for you to remove us. I asked what kind of arrangements he had in mind. Crystal answered. She spoke quietly, almost gently, in the voice I imagined she used when she was telling herself that what she was doing was actually for my benefit. She said it might be time to consolidate accounts, to simplify the paperwork, to have someone family, people who loved me, helping to manage the day-to-day. She said she had looked into some options for updating the deed to reflect the family's involvement going forward. There it was. The deed. She had said the word. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. I said, very quietly, that I appreciated their concern, but that I was not confused. I was not isolated, and I was not interested in changing the deed on my home or consolidating anything with anyone. I said the house was not available, and neither were my finances, and I would very much like them to enjoy the rest of the evening. The quiet lasted approximately 4 seconds. Frank stood up first, which surprised me. He was louder than I had expected. He said I was being unreasonable, that family was supposed to take care of each other, that what Crystal was proposing was completely normal, and I was acting like they were trying to steal from me. Linda chimed in that she had left her home in Greenville a rental. Carl's file noted that she had been 2 months behind on and had expected to be welcomed. Daniel said nothing. Crystal said nothing for a moment either. Then she said, and I want to be careful to recall this exactly because it matters. She said that I had always made Daniel feel like he wasn't good enough, that Thomas had always been my favorite project, and Daniel had always been an afterthought, and that if I was going to sit there in my precious house, full of my precious memories, and refuse to help my own family, then I deserved exactly what I had, nothing but a house full of dead man's furniture and nobody left who cared whether I woke up in the morning. I stood up from the table. I told Crystal that I thought it was time for everyone to go home. She stood up too, and for just a moment, the mask that she had been wearing for 7 years, the careful, patient, strategic mask, came completely off. What was underneath it was something uglier and more honest. Pure, cornered rage. She closed the distance between us very quickly and shoved both hands into my shoulders. I was not expecting it. I hit the edge of the table on the way down. The corner caught me along the left ribs, and I went to the floor hard, my hands skidding on the hardwood. Thomas had refinished by himself the summer before he got sick. The room went silent. I stayed still for a moment. Not because I couldn't move, I could, but because I needed to breathe through the pain, and I needed everyone in that room, and every camera in that room, to see exactly what had just happened, and who had done it, and who was still standing in the doorway doing absolutely nothing. Daniel had not moved. He was standing in the doorway between the dining room and the hallway, with his hand braced on the doorframe. He was looking at me on the floor, and his face held an expression I had never seen on him before and hoped never to see again. Not horror, exactly, and not guilt exactly, but something worse than either, a kind of suspended inaction, as if his body had sent the message that he should do something, and his mind had simply refused to forward it along. I got myself to the floor, pressed my palm to my ribs, and I smiled. I have already told you why. I told them I was fine and just needed a moment. I told Daniel to get Crystal some water and to give me a few minutes to collect myself. He moved, finally, ushering Crystal toward the kitchen, calling after Linda and Frank, who had already backed toward the hallway. I walked to the kitchen, poured my water, and sent Patricia the text. Then I picked up my car keys and my purse. I told them all I was going to step out for some air, that I needed to clear my head, and that I would be back shortly. Daniel asked if I was sure I was all right. I told him I was fine, just a little shaken, and that the front door would lock behind me automatically, which it does. A deadbolt on a timer, a feature Thomas had installed years ago for exactly the kind of situation where one of us left the house distracted and forgot to lock up. What I did not tell Daniel was that I had changed the code to manually override that timer from inside. I drove to the urgent care clinic on Elm Street, 2 miles away. I was inside for 45 minutes. The physician on duty, a young woman named Dr. Anita Rosario, was efficient and thorough. She documented a contusion to the left lateral rib cage, consistent with impact on a hard surface, photographed the bruising that was already developing, noted the exact time of arrival, and listened carefully as I described how I had come to be injured. I gave her Crystal's full name, spelled it for her twice. I signed a consent for the records to be released to law enforcement. I paid out of pocket and kept the receipt. Patricia was waiting in the parking lot when I came out. She had already heard from Carl, who had been monitoring the exterior cameras remotely. She told me they were still inside the house. She told me that Daniel had tried to call me twice. She told me that Crystal and Frank had, approximately 11 minutes after I left, gone into Thomas's study and spent 9 minutes in there before coming back out. Thomas's study, where the filing cabinet was. The one I had left unlocked. The one that contained a folder clearly labeled Property Documents, Birchwood Lane. I asked Patricia what was in that folder. She allowed herself a small smile. Copies of a deed showing clear title to myself and Thomas Calloway. No trust language, no restrictions. Documents that looked, to someone who was not an estate attorney, exactly like what Crystal and Frank would have been hoping to find. They were not real documents. Patricia had prepared them specifically for that cabinet, specifically for this moment. We sat in the parking lot of the urgent care for a moment while Patricia made 2 phone calls. The first was to Detective Warren Cole of the Charlotte PD, who had been briefed on the situation the previous Thursday and was presently on call. The second was to a locksmith, not to change the locks. The timer on the front door deadbolt had been set to engage at 9 p.m., regardless of whether anyone was inside or outside. At 9:02, when the lock engaged automatically, Frank and Linda Hargrove, Crystal, and Daniel were all still inside my house. Patricia and I were in my car down the street, watching on her laptop through the cloud feed. The moment Daniel tried the front door and found it locked from the outside, the atmosphere inside the house changed instantly. I could see it in the camera angle covering the foyer. Crystal checked the door twice. Frank went to the back door, which had been deadbolted from inside before I left. Linda was on her phone, presumably trying to reach me. Daniel was standing very still in the middle of the living room, looking around the way a person does when they have just realized that the situation they thought they controlled has reorganized itself around them entirely. Then Crystal went back to the study. I watched her go through the camera covering the hallway. She was moving quickly now, less careful. She pulled out the folder. She spread the documents on Thomas's desk. She took photographs of every page with her phone. Then she took the folder itself and put it in her bag. There it was. There was the theft. Clean, documented, time-stamped. I turned to Patricia and said, "Now." She made the call. Detective Cole and his partner arrived 6 minutes later. I watched them knock on the front door on the outdoor camera. I watched Daniel answer, pale and confused, and I watched the moment his face changed when he saw the badge. Patricia drove us back to Birchwood Lane. We walked in through the back. I had the code to the secondary keypad entry, the one I had never mentioned to Daniel, because I had always maintained that there are things about your own home it is prudent to keep to yourself. They were all in the living room when we walked in through the kitchen. Daniel's face when he saw me stitched up and bruised, calm, standing next to my attorney at 9:15 on a Sunday evening, was the face of a man understanding for the first time what kind of woman his mother actually was. Detective Cole had already established the situation. He was thorough and professional, and he had, as we had anticipated, already asked Crystal about the folder in her bag. She had not surrendered it. I let Patricia do the speaking for the first few minutes, because Patricia is better in those moments than I am, and because I wanted to watch their faces while the shape of what had happened became clear to each of them in turn. Frank understood first, I think, because Frank had done something like this before. Not exactly, but close enough. He sat down heavily on Thomas's couch and said nothing for the rest of the evening. Linda kept looking at me as if waiting for me to offer some way out. Crystal was still calculating. You could see it, her eyes moving from me to Patricia to the detective and back, looking for an exit that wasn't there. And Daniel was looking at the floor. Detective Cole read them the relevant information. The documents Crystal had taken were evidence in a theft. The camera footage from the dining room showed the shove clearly. The medical documentation was in Patricia's hands. Crystal's unauthorized withdrawals from the joint account, which Patricia laid out on the coffee table in a neat 3-page summary, constituted a separate matter. The false deed documents had been provided as a deliberate test by the property owner. There was no ambiguity about what had occurred. Crystal was arrested. Her parents were not. Carl had been careful to confirm they had touched nothing, but they were advised in the strongest possible terms by Detective Cole that they had 30 minutes to collect their belongings from overnight bags they had apparently already brought, and that if they were found on this property again without my explicit invitation, the outcome would be different. They left without saying goodbye to anyone, including their daughter. That told me everything about the Hargroves I needed to know. Patricia stayed with me while Detective Cole finished processing the scene. Daniel sat on the couch the entire time, not in handcuffs, not charged, but not leaving either. He looked like a man waiting for a sentence to be read. After the detective left, after Patricia had gathered her papers and squeezed my hand and told me she'd call in the morning, after the house was finally quiet, I sat down in Thomas's armchair and looked at my son. He had aged tonight. I don't know how else to say it. He looked like some essential piece of scaffolding had been removed from behind his face. He said, "Mom, I didn't know she was going to do that." He meant the shove. He meant Crystal, and what she had done to me physically. I believed him about that one specific thing. I told him I knew. He said, "I'm sorry." He said it the way people say it when they mean it, and also know that it isn't enough. I told him I knew that too. He said, "I didn't know what else to do. I owed money. I was scared. Crystal said there was a way to handle it, that you would understand, that families do this kind of thing all the time." And this was the moment I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure for 6 months. This was the thing I had needed to see, not whether he would participate in a scheme. I already knew the answer to that, but whether, when the scheme fell apart, there was still something underneath it that I recognized. Whether the boy Thomas and I had raised was still somewhere in there. He was crying. Quietly, the way he had cried at his father's funeral, with his hand over his mouth and his shoulders tight. I told him to sit down. I told him that his debt had been paid, all $40,000, 6 weeks ago, anonymously, that it had been me, that I had known about it for months, and I had paid it without telling him because I had wanted to see what he would do when the pressure was gone. Whether he would come to me, whether he would change course. The silence that followed lasted a long time. He said, "You already paid it?" I said yes. He said, "So I didn't. We didn't have to." I said, "No, you didn't." He pressed both hands over his face. The sound he made was not crying exactly. It was something more collapsed than that. He sat like that for a long time, while the grandfather clock in the hallway counted off the seconds. The same clock Thomas had bought at an estate sale the year Daniel was born, the one he had spent 3 weekends restoring. I let him sit. I did not go to him. I wanted to. Every part of me that had rocked him to sleep and driven him to baseball practice and held him at his father's graveside wanted to go to him. I kept my hands in my lap, because love without consequence teaches nothing. Thomas and I had agreed on that when Daniel was 17, and we had wanted to let him off the hook for something he should have faced. And Thomas had been the one to say, "If we protect him from this, we are not protecting him." I had agreed then. I had to agree now. I told him that I forgave him. I want to be clear about that, because it is true and it matters. I told him I forgave him, and that forgiveness was not the same as what came next, and that what came next was going to be up to him. I told him about the Calloway Family Trust. I showed him the documents. I explained, in the language of the profession I had spent 31 years in, precisely what it meant and precisely what it had always meant. I told him his father and I had created it together, that Thomas had signed it knowing exactly what it was, and that the house would be cared for after I was gone by a foundation in Thomas's name that would fund arts education in the Charlotte public schools, where Thomas had taught for 35 years, and where 3 generations of students had written him letters he kept in a shoebox under the bed. Daniel said, "Dad knew?" I said, "Your father was the one who brought up the idea first." He was quiet for a long time after that. He left around midnight. He did not ask to stay. He shook my hand at the door, which struck me as strange and also correct, and he told me he needed time to think. I told him to take whatever time he needed, and that I would be here when he was ready. I closed the door and stood alone in the foyer for a moment. The house was quiet, in the way it is quiet after everyone has left, and it settles back into itself. The particular quality of silence that belongs to old houses and old marriages, that holds the echo of everything that has happened in it. I could hear the clock. I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could hear, if I was very still, the memory of Thomas's voice reading aloud from the study on winter evenings, something he had done all our lives together, because he said that history deserved to be spoken out loud. I went to the kitchen and made chamomile tea. I sat at the table where Thomas and I had signed trust documents at midnight, with cups gone cold, glasses pushed up on our foreheads, his handwriting in the margins, and mine correcting it. I sat there until the tea was gone, and the clock read 1 in the morning, and the bruise on my ribs had settled into a dull, steady ache. Then I went to bed. Thomas's side was still his side, even now. I had never been able to sleep in the middle. In the months that followed, the legal matters resolved themselves in the way legal matters do slowly, with paperwork. Crystal took a plea agreement. The charges related to the documents were reduced in exchange for cooperation and restitution. Frank and Linda Hargrove quietly relocated to a rental in South Carolina. I did not hear from them again. Daniel went to therapy. He told me this in a letter, a handwritten one, 3 months after that Sunday dinner. It was 4 pages long. He talked about his father. He talked about the gambling, about the shame of it, about how Crystal had been the first person who had never once looked at him with disappointment, and how he had confused that with love when it was something more transactional than that. He said he thought about Thomas every day. He said he didn't expect anything from me. He said he just wanted me to know that he was trying. I read that letter at the kitchen table. Then I read it again. Then I put it in the shoebox under the bed, next to the letters Thomas had kept from his students. Because it belonged there. Because it was evidence of something trying to grow from terrible ground. I wrote back. It was a short letter. I told him I was glad he was getting help. I told him I loved him, which was true and would always be true, regardless of what happened next. I told him the door to this house, Thomas's house, our house, would be open to him the day he could walk through it as himself, not as anyone's instrument, not as a man running from something, but as himself. I told him his father would have wanted that. The following spring, Patricia came for dinner. She brought wine, a good one, the kind we had started allowing ourselves since Thomas's death because life is short and he would have been annoyed at us for saving it for occasions. We sat on the back porch in the evening air and looked at the garden, and she told me that the Thomas Callaway Arts Education Foundation had made its first grant cycle, 11 teachers across 6 schools, new instruments and materials and residency programs. She showed me photographs on her phone. Classrooms full of children, a music room with a new upright piano in the corner, a mural project in a hallway, kids standing in front of what they had made, squinting into the camera with the particular pride of people who have created something that will last. I thought about Thomas standing in front of a classroom for 35 years, his handwriting in the margins, his shoebox of letters, his voice reading history out loud because he believed it deserved to be heard. I raised my glass and I said, "There he is." Patricia raised hers. The evening light came through the trees the way it does in spring, low and gold. And the house at my back was as solid as it had ever been, as full of him as it had ever been, and I was 67 years old, and I had lost my husband, and very nearly lost my son. And I had fought to hold on to the thing that meant more to me than either of my own hands. And I was still here, and the house was still standing, and somewhere in Charlotte, in a classroom Thomas Callaway had never seen, a child was learning that beautiful things are worth making, and worth protecting, and worth leaving behind for the people who come after you. That seemed to me like enough. That seemed to me like exactly enough.